seminar speaker, Andrew Achenbaum. He's professor of history and social work and holder of the Gerson and Sabina Professorship in Global Aging at the University of Houston, Texas. He's written 5 books, edited 12 others, written dozens of articles. Most recently is his book, Older Americans, Vital Communities, published by Johns Hopkins Press in 2005. And the title of his talk today is called Robert Butler, Aging's Visionary Mentor. Some of you might know the late Robert Butler was one of gerontology's leading pioneers and advocates, and is the subject of Dr. Achenbaum's current book project, which he's working on while visiting St. Thomas University in Fredericton as chair in gerontology. I'd also like to add on a personal note that Dr. Achenbaum, or Andy as he allows me to call him, is also one of gerontology's leaders and mentors, whose work has brought together the humanities and aging studies in so many enriching ways and critical ways that have expanded and tested gerontology's multidisciplinary ideals. And from his first book, Old Age in the New Land, published way back when, 1978, Andy has been an intellectual force, breaking new ground and developing and challenging others, myself included, to do the same. So I'm very proud and very pleased to present him here today.
Well, I'm astounded. How much are they paying you per head to show up? It's wonderful. And it's a great occasion because 3 years ago I was at a Gerontological Society meeting, and this wonderful young woman gave a terrific talk. And I went up to her and I said, Bernice Newgarden would be proud of you. And she looked at me skeptically and then sheepishly and said, who is Bernice Newgarden? It's really amazing that a field which doesn't eat its elders forgets them hours after they die. And so I must admit that part of the reason why I'm here is twofold. The talk that I'm going to give you is going to be a longer version of a talk I'd like to give at this year's GSA, because the GSA has allowed Rick Moody, a dear friend of mine, and I, to organize a session, not a memorial service, not a roast, but somewhere in between, in honor of Robert Butler. And I think that writing his biography is one of the greatest privileges I could have. His memory has to be preserved because he was a wonderful guy, but more especially because in the 60 years in which he was an expert in aging, he really set into place certain institutional arrangements. And I think it's profoundly important for those of us who are getting a little long in teeth and much more long-winded to try to leave some sort of memory that's institutional, that puts it in place. So we have till 2?
Oh, yes.
We have till 4?
Sure.
I'd like to...
2:30.
We really have till 2:30? I really want questions. I'd like questions during it, because it'll blow up the video, and that's always important. But what I'd like to do is break this into 2 parts. One, I'm going to work on the assumption that it's a name, and you don't know very much. So I'm going to give you just the facts, the bare facts, although it's going to take me a while to get through them all. And then I'm going to sort of put on my historian, not quite as good as Stephen Katz, but as good as I could get, critical voice. Why is this guy so damn important? How did he do it? And then end, lest he worry that this would be too much hagiography, but why did he not succeed as far as he wanted? So those 3 parts. Part 1. Part 1 is it began on a cold, snowy night in January of 1927 in New York. His parents split within 8 months of his birth, and he was raised basically by his grandparents. His grandfather was his mentor. His grandfather died at the age of when he was 7. His grandfather was 76. He was a chicken farmer. And no one told him. He went to Oklahoma. So this poor kid developed anxiety. And if this weren't bad, 7 plus 1927, he was in the Great Depression. One thing that I think is true about Bob Butler, and is true about the so-called Great Generation in the United States, is that they were really sorely tested by the Great Depression. And frankly, I'm such a wimp and wuss, if I had been put in such a situation, I probably would have collapsed. Said, what the hell, I'm done. But this group had grit. And this guy had grit. He had a doctor who saved his life at the age of 9. He had scarlet fever. Scarlet fever wasn't that big a deal in the 1930s. It was a killer in 1900. But it was enough that he really almost died. His mother remarries, and in 1941 he moves to West 91st Street, the west side of New York in Manhattan. And he's bright. He's lazy, but he's bright. So he takes tests. The United States are big on tests. We leave all sorts of children behind, especially if they're of a certain color. But in this case, Butler passed and was sent to DeWitt Clinton High School. That means something more to me, perhaps even to Stephen Katz, than to anyone else in the room. It had 12,000 students, largely New York immigrant Jews. Some of the great intellectuals of the 40s, 50s, and 60s graduated from DeWitt Clinton. Butler was not Jewish, and so he got to meet his teachers on Yom Kippur. And on Yom Kippur, they took him under wing and kicked his butt. So did his stepfather. Sufficiently that he went to Columbia for about 4 months. World War II is broken out. He wants to go into the military. Columbia happens to be the biggest naval recruiting station in the world. He has flat feet. And so like a third of all American men who apply for the military in World War II, he's rejected. This boy doesn't stop. He joins the Merchant Marines, which normally as a civilian move troops, move cargoes, but in World War II, in fact, is part of the U.S. Navy as an auxiliary, but doesn't give GI benefits. That's going to be very important. I got through grad school on a GI benefit. This guy's going to have to pay for his own education. And by the way, the Merchant Marine ships were really poorly made. His blew up twice, and so the fact that he has lived this far is a testimony to his resilience and spunk. At Columbia, only at a place like the University of Toronto, Harvard, Chicago, Stanford, maybe Michigan, can you sit there and say, people take ideas seriously? John Dewey's shadow from 1903 is still there. Jacques Barzon is still there. Max Frankel is still there. This boy is brought into the best undergraduate core curriculum in America. Harvard, to be fair, had produced the general education document, but they never approved it. Chicago was so airy-fairy that they were reading classics in Greek, but they had no idea what they were doing. At Columbia, it was real. It was interdisciplinary, it was tough, and this kid took to it like water. Sciences, to be fair, at Columbia were less strong than the humanities and social sciences, but he sought them out. He had Nobel laureates for teachers as an undergraduate. But he wasn't just a nerd. He's a handsome guy, actually, and quite a friend. He joined the student newspaper. There are a few student newspapers in the United States you want to work for: the Harvard Crimson, the Michigan Daily, and the Columbia Spectator. He was editor-in-chief of the Columbia Spectator. He managed to steal the press of the New York Times one night when Ike became the president of Columbia and produced a 32-page issue. The deans all got to know Bob Butler. And the deans helped get him in to Columbia Medical School. which at the time was not Harvard and wasn't Hopkins. I don't want to wax this too much, but was certainly among the 5 best medical schools in America. And the same thing happens. The guy was a sponge. I knew him, sort of. To talk to him was to talk to a Renaissance person. He really was an intellectual in the best sense of the word. And for him, medicine was not only a science, it was an intellectual curiosity. So he graduates from Columbia. They expect him to stay at Columbia. They're a terribly inbred bunch down there. And instead, he goes across the nation to Langley Porter, which is now part of the University of California, San Francisco, so he can study psychopharmacology. This, in the 1950s, is a big deal. It is, in fact, where psychiatry is today. Most psychiatrists are drug dealers, not Freudian. And he there learned something about the interactions. Notice the multidisciplinarity that I'm trying to stress. Here's a guy who can stress the cognitive side and, in fact, the basic biomedical side. He is so impressive. He's plucked, and this is what happens in the United States. He's part of a small, low birth court. So it's like a teacher who walks into class the first day and says, bright, resolutely stupid, and then waits to see if their hypotheses are correct. This guy is really talented. So he's plucked up to go to the National Institute of Mental Health in 1955, where he will stay until 1966. The National Institute of Mental Health is not one of the big centers at the National Institutes of Health, which in my country is in fact the best university in the world. It is unbelievably powerful. It is filthy rich, although they're always screaming about cutbacks, and they do innovative work. And what he does is he works with this guy named Jim Buren, perhaps that's a name you know, and Louis Sokoloff, Virginia Yarrow, and a guy named Seymour Katz. This is like Frick, Frack, Bozo, and Andy. And they all work together as an interdisciplinary team for 9 years. And they produced 2 books. They did this at the University of Toronto today, they wouldn't have gotten tenure. But back then, 2 books, which are in fact important books, that gets you somewhere. The books were called Healthy Aging 1 and Healthy Aging 2. They were not, in fact, terribly imaginative in their titles, but they were absolutely revolutionary in their concept. Old people are crocs. Old people are stupid. And what they did, doing case measurements, brain tests, was to in fact prove, using healthy people in the community, not people who were in institutions, not people who were in hospitals, they proved that in fact older people could be healthy. Older people could grow. They did longitudinal studies. It was absolutely patented. In 1966, he leaves and starts his own clinical practice in Washington, D.C. 1966. Old people. There's some old people, they're mostly in the U.S. Senate. But in fact, there are not very many psychiatrists who are working with older people or dabbling in politics. Butler was in the 1968 election as a McCarthy delegate. He was a rebel, the most courtly, genteel man you'd ever want to meet, and beneath the surface was a guy who fumed at injustice. So in 1969, with a guy named Carl Bernstein of Bernstein and Woodward fame, he does a newspaper article and he coins a word called ageism. You want to write that down. A-G-E-I-S-M. Ageism, he thought, was prejudice against people who are old, similar to prejudice by race and by sex. I'm not sure I agree with the definition, but we can talk about that during question and answer. But it really sold. And then, to hear him tell it, sitting in his library, he would pull files off the shelf every night. And in 1975, after an editor told him to cut it by a third, he published a book called Why Survive? Being Old in America. If you buy his argument, and I did, the chapters don't follow one from another. I can see this guy sitting down and say, that's interesting. And he's a dork. He's a wonk. He makes David Stockman look like he's laid back. It's just all this data. They're abused. They're poor. They're neglected. Here's what I found. The book sells. Meanwhile, Congress, over Richard Nixon's almost dead but surely soon to be impeached body, has decided that they will create the National Institute on Aging. Quirky place. They want to study healthy people. He takes the job. He's probably the fifth choice. The main choice, I don't think I'm breaking this on tape. The main choice was rejected for reasons we can get into in question and answer, but I'm not going to volunteer. So the first day on the job, he wins the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction for Why Survive. First day. I'd like to make a good impression on you. That's why I brought my Trader Joe's bag, my academic bag. A dirty old man, he's wearing a raincoat with a liner, but Pulitzer Prize on your first day. That's very, very impressive. But he's toast. The director of the National Institute on Health had fought this institute and left. American men fight all the time. The head of NIMH hated him. They loved him when he was doing healthy aging. Now they hate him because he's taking some of the aging stuff. And what's all this stuff about studying biology and processes, social, demography? God, next year you tell me they did history. Well, he cut the line. But he did decide he needed a disease. Because every Institute of Health in Washington has disease, cancer, heart, what have you. So he picks Alzheimer's. And he picks Alzheimer's because he knows something as a neuropsychiatrist. Because most people don't know what it is, and they're scared of it. The biologists are ready to kill him. It's always a zero-sum game in the United States. You've seen enough academic politics. It's always. And the smaller the stake, the more nasty you fight. But he's stuck with it. He stuck with it until a call came out of the blue asking of him if he'd be willing to open a geriatric medical center in a hospital. This guy has been pushing for academic medicine all along. He doesn't particularly care if geriatrics is a specialty, but he wants people like this young lady who's studying psychology and physiology to have some sort of aging component. So he is thrilled to have a geriatrics program somewhere. I don't want to move. He had a really nice house. In fact, the family still owns it on Cleveland Park in Washington, which is right below the National Cathedral. It's not quite Yorkville, but it's getting close. We'll give you a park in front of your house. They bought him a place in the Beresford, which if you need to have a condo in New York, is probably the one you want. 81st and Central Park West, 4 bedrooms. He thought about it. He made up a deal. It sounded great. The guy loved money. He could attract money. He walked in a room and people grabbed their checkbooks, not only to write checks, but to protect themselves with his charismatic ability to raise money. So within about a year and a half, he had 4 chairs in this geriatric medicine. But he had 2 problems. One was the guy who hired him left. You always want to ask a potential boss how long they expect to stay around. Because if the person who hires you leaves, they may not like you with their successor, or worse, have one of their buddies that they want to stick in your place. Second, hospitals in New York don't operate like beds in NIH. In NIH, if he wanted hospital beds, he got hospital beds. In Mount Sinai, there's just so many beds you can stick into a room the size, they counted the beds, and they were given by specialty. So any bed extra he got meant someone else couldn't get it. I have fought some tough battles, and I will be glad to show you the body scars that have resulted from those battles. It was tough. And so, in 1992, he shifts gears again and creates something called the International Longevity Center. He does it this time with Japanese money. Now, this is bad days for Japan, but back in the late 80s, early 90s, it was very good times for Japan, and they had tons of money. And he had a national, international reputation. The day of the huge stock crash that hit the world in 1988, two CEOs were willing to talk to him, and they create, in fact, a center, which now has 13 units. It was interested in societal aging. Indeed, for the last 4 or 5 years, Dr. Butler was really concerned between the connection between health and wealth. And his connection and belief was that unless we did something for underdeveloped and developing countries, they would never be able to reap the benefits of productive aging or buy our goods. There was a bit of the realpolitik to the guy. At the time of his death, he had 4 daughters who adored him. Absolutely adored him. This will never go into the book. We're going to shut off the machine. They loved him. I have rarely seen kids love a parent the way he was loved. And if you ask me what his real legacy was, that's it. That's it. He was also married once to Myrna Lewis, a distinguished psychotherapist. Her death broke him apart. I remember calling him when she was dying. He was like my father. Thank you for calling. I'm busy. Click. But he found love. Oh, he found love. She was a terrific woman. He died 3 days after he entered the hospital. He had dinner with his personal physician the night before he went into the hospital. He had not quite told people that he had a rare blood disease. The doctor figured it out and told him to call his family because he'd be dead at the end of the weekend. Part 1A. One of the things I have not talked about so far, but which gets us into the discussion of all this, is he wrote an article in 1963. Stephen was very kind to say that my first book made my career. In fact, if I had been smart, I probably wouldn't have destroyed any more trees after that. If you can do something very, very well right off the bat, that's good. In 1963, he wrote an essay in psychiatry called Life Review. And what he wanted was once again to combat the negative stereotypes of older people. Older people are garrulous. You'll have that feeling by about 2. They make random stray thoughts. He didn't believe that. And he thought it was in part because young doctors didn't know how to listen to old people. And secondly, they dealt with institutionalized people. Those of you who know anything about the history of aging know that in the 19th century, the really famous works by Loomis and Charcot were done in huge institutional settings. Not surprisingly, these people are sick. We talk to this crowd, we get a slightly different view. What Butler believed was critical was to deal with unresolved issues. And to deal with those unresolved issues so that you could have some sense of where you were in the present. And then on the side, in 1963, he mentioned that people have to face death. This man was not afraid of death. We talked at great length. He was afraid of a horrible dying, tubes, protracted, but he wasn't the least bit afraid of death. In intervening years, with a psychotherapist who he married, Myrna Lewis, he created a questionnaire, which essentially asked biographical details, and then asked questions about who your friends were. What mattered? What Butler was really interested in life review was not just what I've done, tell facts, but evaluate the facts. Life review is evaluative. Life review says, it is sometimes random. Stephen and I have known each other for 20 years. I don't think we've seen each other for 5. On one level, we can pick absolutely right up from where we were. That's the joy of late life friendship. But every once in a while, you throw rears. Stephen, the laundromat doesn't work in Fredericton. How would you feel if I brought dirty laundry? I could see him in front of the screen. This guy is really tripping out. And by God, within 2 hours of arrival at his house, I always put the liquid in first. It happens that he looked back at life review. And his daughters at his memorial service gave me a copy of his latest essay on life review, which was dated June 25th, a week before he died. I am not going to quote for his memoir for reasons that I'll explain if you ask. But I do think that quoting from this is fair, because this is going to become part of the public domain. It'll become part of the Butler website. Essentially what he says is, elders still have a future. It may not be as long as my grandchild's, or it may be, who knows? I'm not God. But they have a future. And he emphasizes in a way that I think too many gerontologists don't, that we need a life course perspective. You are very lucky at this institute to stress that as part of your title. People do not instantly become 65. I wish they did, because then I'd be eligible for Medicare. But there is, in fact, this process which goes on. And elders, he felt, had to, in fact, seize the present. What a novel concept. I'm a historian. I'm paid, not big bucks, but I'm paid to study the past. And I'm constantly anxious about what my next meal's going to look like. It is very hard for me to focus in on the present, to relieve myself from the anxiety of time. But Butler argues that in life review, what you want to do is to rediscover some of those memories of childhood. Not to become childish, but to become childlike in your sense of playfulness. He was. You know how I interviewed him? He walked through Central Park in January. I am freezing my butt. I cannot hear him speak. He's hard of hearing. It is like 2 old men in a very bad sitcom. And then we have dinner. He'd eat 4 leaves of spinach. I'd look at him. And finally I said, hell, if this is what it takes to become 83, I want to die. He was a child, impish. And he loved nature. I've been asked a couple times, why did you go to Fredericton? Because that's where the leaves are. I'm no nature boy. Trust me. I'm no nature boy. To give me a saw is to make me suicidal. But I do appreciate nature. To be old is to be rebellious. It's not by accident that one of his best friends was Maggie Kuhn, the head of our Gray Panthers. She was a feisty woman. God, she was feisty. Sarcastic, rebellious. Butler did not think old age was peaches and cream. In fact, as I've suggested before, he found a certain degree of anger useful in old age. Anger at your washing machine? No. Anger at injustice. Anger at inequities. He was a politician. And he was concerned, frightfully concerned, about legacy. He wanted to leave something for his kids. He was making it perfectly clear to me that I was writing this book so I would get the message right. And so, it seems to me that here was a guy who lived his life as if he was doing life review all of his life. There are spots, gaps in the story. As a historian, I'm obliged to find some of them. They're irrelevant to this story, so I'm not going to share them. But I do believe that there were, in fact, 4 themes. I'll try to quit by 2. 4 themes that made him successful. So let me go through the 4, and then we'll take questions, unless there are questions right now. You're all awake? Going once, going twice. 1 was resilience. Resilience is a big buzzword. One of the presidents of GSA made it her theme. I think it's profoundly important, and he had spades. When all you have are lemons, make lemonade. From a chicken farm in Vinewood, New Jersey, to eating dinner at Barbara Walder's house, something had to have happened. And as I suggested early on, part of it is that early childhood formation. On one level, if this were a psychohistory, if I were Erik Erikson, I would play to the hilt, the abandonment. That's anxiety producing. I have a grandchild. She has learned to crawl. Life as we know it has now ceased. It's very interesting to leave the room and to see how she reacts. There's a little bit of fear. So she goes over to her father's computer and starts messing with it, because maybe he'll come back. This guy had lots of support. Dr. Rose, who saved him from scarlet fever. He was buddies with his friends. If you want to read a book to understand Bob Butler, in fact, if you want to read a book to understand the United States with the Great Generation, pick up Glenn Elder's Children of the Great Depression. Because he's a textbook case, ELDER, Children of the Great Depression. Friends, peers, even at a young age, are critical. Even if they live on the wrong side of town in Vinewood and go to a crummy elementary school. This guy liked girls so much that he picked his first faith-based tradition, depending on who walked into which church. He didn't like religion, though. He apparently didn't like the girls that much, so he usually dropped out. But we get some sort of sense. And then there's these teachers. And then there's the confidence of World War II. I could never get my father to talk about his World War II. I know he was shot at the Battle of the Bulge. I know he married the head of the hospital. They both had really weird backgrounds. I think they must have looked each other in the face and decided if we're going to get married, we're going to do it over here because our parents will kill us if we try to do it in the States. And the rest, as they say, is history. Butler matured on that Marine ship. The captain was drunk. The second and the third mates were sitting in their bed terrified. He's 17 years old, in charge of a cargo ship. Columbia must have looked like a cakewalk after that. Second, he was intellectually curious. I think the reason why I went into academia is my sophomore year in college, some guy got up and said he was happy. I looked at him. And then I went to his office. This was back in the days when you could smoke, so you opened his door and it looked like a papal election pouring out of his office. And I looked at him and I said, "Why are you happy? Why are you asking?" My father's a great guy. Successful, generous, blah, 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 blah. Read the Boy Scout Oath. But I've never heard him say he was happy. He looked at me and he said, "I'm hooked on the power of ideas. I've never used cocaine, but that was the closest equivalent to cocaine that I've ever gotten in my life. Ideas are extraordinarily powerful. Ideas matter. I do believe the pen is mightier than the sword." And this guy decided, despite all the disadvantages, that he wanted to become a doctor at the age of 7. He almost looked back his senior year in high school. He had a couple of friends who suggested they open up a business operation in South America. But he stayed with medicine. Not the 8 minutes a patient type medicine, but the whole person sort of medicine. He was curious about me. And I think it was partly because, like any good idea, there was a combination of imagination. To talk to that guy was to realize the power of imagination. But he wasn't stoned. He was disciplined. Terribly disciplined. Methodical. You do not write an editorial for the college newspaper 300 days a year without being able to crank it out. And there are very few physicians who have that skill. But it's going to come back and serve him when he writes Why Survive, and it's going to come back and serve him when he writes 200 scholarly articles. His report, his first report at the National Institute of Aging, was called Our Future Selves. God, if I were sure no one read history, I'd plagiarize it right now. It's perfect. It's our future selves. I have a stake in what the National Institute of Aging is going to do. These people we're looking at have a future. He had a master with words. And he was multidisciplinary. I'm a dilettante. The nice thing about being a historian is I'm so far out in third base, I become third base, not a serious player. They call me in to give an invocation, they call me in to give a conclusion, but when we get substantive, they expect me to go to the men's room. But in the process, I can watch different minds go together. I once had the privilege of spending 10 years of my life at the University of Michigan, of working with a postdoc in psychology. It took us 3 years to write an article on wisdom. 3 long years. I was tall, she was short. She was bright, I was dumb. We would not write one word unless we both agreed. We got to know each other. It was interdisciplinary. It's amazing she got tenure. And the other part, besides imagination and curiosity and discipline is he was a stickler, committed to excellence. Places like, no offense, Toronto, Harvard, have to fight the distinction between elitism and excellence. The presumption is, if we're here, we are. And chances are, you are. I'm not going to disagree with that. It's a great university, and I'm privileged to be able to talk to some of you for a while here. But at the end of the day, if we've learned anything from the women's movement, from the increasing globalization of the world, is different people have different ways of looking at the world. And so a white guy like me who's kind of naive really has the world open to him by different impulses. Wholesale? Nah. There's a threshold. You know there's a threshold. And if it's not there, it's not there. We either work on it or we scrap it. 3. The guy had an incredible degree of political savvy. And I've already sort of highlighted that a bit in his experiences with NIA. They wanted him to fail. Can you imagine the jealousy when the turkey wins a Pulitzer Prize the first day? I mean, yeah, it's pretty serious. I realize it's not getting an article in Science, but it's pretty good. And there he was. Worse, he walked out of his own office and met the directors of all the other institutes. He even walked across the grass. He actually could find their offices. I'm not sure the director of NIH knew where their offices were or cared. He would bring them together to meet, to talk about collaborative projects. Most of them said, "What are you smoking?" and walked out of the room. But he tried. And he did capitalize on the Pulitzer. He was pretty modest. Well, actually, he wasn't. He knew who he was. But he was congenial about it. "Hi, I'm Bob Butler. I won a Pulitzer Prize. When did you win yours?" That was really something. But he made certain connections with people. And he played to the media. I'd play to the media, but I'm too ugly. This guy played anywhere. Hugh Downs called him. Barbara Walters called him. The New York Times called him. They'd call him at 10 o'clock at night. He had an answer in 15 minutes. When I would interview him, he would have interviews. He had interviews to interviews. He knew that the media was critical. I'm sure it's critical here because I am a visiting fellow with Jan Wong. Fortunately, he never had to be interviewed by Jan Wong, or if he did, he would have died earlier. But the bottom line is there are certain people who are really tremendously influential. And he was the guy to go to. And that's exactly what he wanted to make. You got an honest answer, you got a bright answer, and you got a quick answer. He did the same routine at Mount Sinai. And there, if we had time and we don't, he did end runs. And so now, the 4th, to get back to the title that Stephen reminded me when we gave this talk. He really was aging's visionary. I'm going to use it as the title of the book, except I'm going to put apostrophe S in very small script, because he was, in fact, one who was the visionary throughout his entire life. And he was the visionary for the field. The guy was a policy wonk. Americans love policy wonks. Oh, Americans love Canadians like Michael Ignatieff because they're charming and they're intellectuals, but I'm not sure what a policy wonk he might be. Mr. Clinton was somebody I knew. Clinton would sit in a room like this with 100 pages of policy stuff and flip to page 50. And he would kill you with details. I'm not sure Obama's quite that good, but Obama plays that same sort of game. Americans love wonks. And he could go across the field. He really understood biomedicine. He kept up with it. Oh, my friend Joshua Lederberg, he was a year or two behind me at Columbia and won the Nobel Prize. And I would take the notes, and I'd go, what the hell is he talking about? And then I'd go home at night, and I'd go on Google or Wikipedia, which I think is actually a great source. And I would never understand what I had just written down. Lost to the ages. He understood economics. Hi, I'm Bob Butler. Do you mind if I come up to your office at Yale? So virtually every Nobel laureate for the last 10 years were his best buds. In fact, he funded a couple. Robert Fogel, a historian who had written Slave Time on the Cross, got money from Butler to study longevity. He was interested in ethics. Dan Callahan, who I think is wrong on mostly everything, but has made, in fact, a tremendous reputation in the field of American bioethics. And he was international. I had the privilege of going to his memorial service in September. Japan, Britain, France, Canada, all around the nation. He was cosmopolitan in the best sense. 2 minutes for impediments. He loved politics, but he always thought he deserved more. As most of you know, American politics has been an unmitigated disaster, probably since John Adams, but most recently since Richard Nixon. There have been a few bright spots for 4 minutes. Jimmy Carter looked like the perfect technocrat before he, in fact, concluded. Bill Clinton, I've mentioned him. This is a mixed crowd. I will let you just pause on Bill Clinton. Butler expected to be his Health and Human Services Secretary. They used him. They put Fernando Torres Gil as the first Assistant Secretary of Aging at his advice. But he didn't make it. And Obama didn't call at all. Apparently, he didn't have a cell phone that worked. And he was increasingly convinced at the end that not only was there ageism against him, he was one vital 83-year-old. I used to watch him. He wasn't performing, he just did it. He'd get anxious sitting in a seat, so he'd get down on the floor wearing a coat and tie and start doing push-ups. I haven't done push-ups since the Army. Why don't you join me? Oh, I think I'm just going to sit here and take notes, Doctor. He felt that philanthropies were passing him up. American philanthropy is deadly. A new person comes in, they change their agenda. I think he didn't lose because of ageism, but because the foundation changed its support. Worse, I'm not sure that we in North America, and here I really would like some help, have settled on the level of discourse that gets to this ageism in a way that's positive. Mr. Katz, I understand, wrote a very good book called Disciplining Old Age, which gets us some direction in that direction. I looked at Katz's library today and I understood where cultural aging had come from. I wonder if this guy gave us too much. Because he gave us productive aging. That came out of the 1983 Salzburg conference. Productive aging was just what it sounds like. The Protestant ethic comes to America. Stay productive, stay valuable, you'll be fine. He gave us successful aging, although that was cribbed a bit by Jack Rowe and Bob Kahn in a book by that title a few years later. What the hell is successful aging? I'm not dead. He gave us shortgevity. He wrote a book called The Longevity Revolution. It was his last major book. It was sort of a bomb, but he really liked it. And in the middle of it, he talks about shortgevity. Shortgevity is what I started with this discussion, and that is the inequalities in length of life. I mean, surely if you go around the world, it's very, very clear that life expectancy at birth has increased in developing as well as non-developing countries. But on average, those in countries which are developing don't live on average as long. I think if I had been he, I would have stuck with Our Future Selves, the title of his 1978 program report for the National Institute on Aging. And I would have done it for two reasons. One, Our Future Selves implies a life course perspective. If I have made one major intellectual mistake in my career, one that's shared by most people in the U.S. gerontology field, it has been not to pay sufficient attention to the relationship between pediatrics and geriatrics, to look at the various life transitions over the life course. I think that's one reason why Glenn Elder's book is so important. I think someone like the late Tamara Reeven's books are so important, because they really do put old age into a context. And second, and I think this is something, speaking as an American boomer, is key. I nearly died a couple years ago. That's a very sobering experience, especially if you're unconscious as they're giving you last rites. But then you wake up and they tell you you should be dead. It wasn't my ex-wife saying, "I wish you were dead." It was that I should be dead. There's a slight difference. There's a slight difference there. And she wouldn't have said it anyway, I hope. But what the hell am I going to do with the rest of my life? This question of legacy, the U.S. really depends on. And there are a lot of areas, God knows, we should be thinking about. My children have almost made me green, tarnished brown, but they've tried to make me green. And when Stephen told me today what you have to do in order to dispose of goods in Ontario, I realized I wasn't in Kansas, much less Texas, anymore. But I do think this question of legacy is something that Butler really affords us a conscious look at. And in that light, if I had to pick my bet, I would pick it on the area of ageism. The United States were so damn politically correct that if I made a comment about this group or that group or this group or that group or this group, chances are I'd be sued. But if I make a facetious comment about myself or someone my age, it's funny. It's hilarious. It's ridiculous. So yeah, Bob, I'll try to write the best biography I can. And in my day job, I'll make ageism a cause. Thank you. So, it's 2:10. I'm history at 2:30. So whatever you want to talk about.
Could you say a bit more about the life review?
Sure. He changed it remarkably little. If I were you, I would Google up Psychiatry 1963, and it's called The Life Review. Or I would get Bernice Newgarten's Middle Age and Aging,
yes,
which
you
was
mentioned her at the beginning.
You're right.
What's the surname? Bernice?
Bernice.
And then?
And then Bernice Newgarten, Neugarten. And his life review article is abridged in her book, which is called Middle Age and Aging. It was published by the University of Chicago Press in 1968. And I think it's a remarkably robust piece of work. What I was implying was that over time, in the beginning of that life review article, he said that he thought life review was a universal biochemical function, which sort of fits the disengagement theory of coming. And anytime people talk about universal, historians get nervous and now gerontologists get nervous. I mean, there are very few things that you're going to die. I'm willing to admit that that's a universal. But to say that life review is intrinsic to the human condition is, I think, wrong. And I think he acknowledged that over time. And so what he stressed was, can I evaluate parts of my life? Can I be put in a situation where in his case, his early childhood would be very, very interesting to listen to him talk about. When he wrote Life Review in this last issue, he took verbatim what he had written about his early life in Why Survive and just put it in text. Now, as a friend and a biographer, I find that interesting. I'm not going to comment on it. I've just commented on it by saying interesting and pausing. Apparently, he didn't want to worry about that. There were other things he wanted to talk about. So what he talked about was more about late life. And what he was stressing was that healthy aging goes beyond a mental and physical state. It goes towards an attitude towards the present, which says I will seize the present, and I will look towards this future. And in part of my future, at least in this last article, is that I will become more rebellious, and I will really worry about legacy. And I think he was onto something. Keep going. That's not enough, I can tell from your face.
Oh, no, that's good. Thank you.
I have a quick question.
Oh, God, no.
No, just little. It's just little. It's not big.
Yeah, the big one will be in the car.
Yeah.
We'll have a collision on it.
That's right. We'll have to. Some people have recently criticized Butler for kind of making the transition from senility to Alzheimer's disease as a kind of displacement. I mean, the logic around ageism is understood, of course, which is senility was quite a negative kind of constellation of images and discourse itself, while Alzheimer's as a disease, in a way, removed, or at least was a bulwark against that negativity. The person is obviously not responsible for being sick and not responsible for having Alzheimer's, and along with the promise of a disease is a promise of a cure and remediation and even, some kind of hope. However, critics have claimed that Alzheimer's has produced another set of kind of ostracizing stereotypes because it's a disease category that doesn't necessarily help people who have dementia. In other words, claiming that they have a disease doesn't necessarily help their care, etc., and that maybe we should look to the past again to see if senility wasn't some kind of perhaps more benign, broader, non-medical sort of label or condition. So I'm just wondering what you think of that particular little tension now.
I want to ride home, so I obviously he had serious critics. Peter Whitehouse, Ballinger, Jesse Ballinger, Martha Holstein, all took him to task for this. And I hate to be his defender just for the sake of being his defender, but I will tell you what we used to talk about. One is that he was well aware that there were other dementias besides Alzheimer's, and so I'm not sure he was willing to conflate everything into Alzheimer's. He was really convinced that he would not have saved the National Institute of Aging unless he had a disease. And then he would start talking about the money we spent in the United States. We have spent in excess of $200 billion fighting cancer. And while we can do some things with breast cancer and prostate cancer, and if you get testicular cancer within 12 hours, we can do something with that, we in fact don't have a cure yet. And his answer, I think, about Alzheimer's research would be, nothing's panned. Nothing's panned yet. And I don't think anything has panned. I mean, everyone had great hope for the genome coming up with lock so-and-so, and that hasn't come through. He gave his brain to Hopkins with the hope that that would help with the advance. but he didn't see any solution to Alzheimer's in my children's lifetime because he thought it was so intractable. And so, yeah, he was worried about exactly what you're saying. But I think he was more worried about the fact that Americans really believe they're magic bullets. And we have not found a magic bullet in this area. And then when I remember making some comment that was not facetious, but saying, haven't we spent on, and he said, well, nothing compared to cancer. And that was his, and of course cancer would be what he'd look at, because in 1937, NIH, the National Institute of Health, which was really sort of a backwater thing in 1937, got big, in part because the Lasker Foundation and the president said, cancer's serious, I want to fight this disease. And so all of a sudden, this piddling budget jumps up to do National Cancer Institute. And if you look at the budgets, I think there are 22, 23 institutes now. NIA is still pretty paltry. That's a BS answer, but it's just as good an answer as I can give you.
Thank you.
Yes?
Earlier on in your talk, you mentioned that you had some reservations about defining ageism as we might, or as a kind of corollary to sexism and racism. And I'm wondering if extending...
I think age cuts both ways, right? He meant it to be, I don't want to persecute old people. But I find myself, and it's really terrible, I teach largely middle-aged social workers, young undergraduates. And I'll say kid. Kid? They're 40. That's ageist. I'm never going to be black. As much as I like women, I'm never going to be a woman. I think if I'm gay, I should have found that out a couple days ago. So none of those are, but I am going to be old. Everybody's going to be old unless they're dead. And so it seems to me that this prejudice is somewhat different. I think racism is repugnant. I think some of the things that are said in the United States these days are appalling. I have 2 daughters and a granddaughter. You can imagine what I think about sexism. And while I was raised to be homophobic, I think I'm better. Not there, but better. Ageism? I'm terrible. But I think it's both ways, and that's the reservation. He really, and even to the end, he really focused mainly. And it was sort of ironic to me because the guy who's taking this life course perspective, you would have thought would have been able to expand it. But that's what we mean by not being him.
So is there an opportunity to, again, you expressed some anxiety about, as a historian, some anxieties about appealing to universals, like ageism itself. I mean, is there a way to maybe redeem or recuperate the idea that
that's a terrific question, and watch this for a elusive answer. When I do policy, which isn't that often, but when I do it, I usually have in mind a woman who's 80, who's eligible for Medicaid and welfare but doesn't get it. So, if I look at the sort of incredible health disparities and economic inequities in the United States, am I saying that I should start with race, then move? And the answer, and that's where the universal, it seems to me, you almost have to be a particularist. I would be very surprised in the United States, I certainly can't speak for here, but here, it just seems to me very cursory. This difference between urban and rural plays much more in Canada than it does in the United States. I realize there's, West Texas I've never seen, but it looks getting big. I don't think we think about rural in the United States. I don't see how anyone in Canada did not think about rural. And so the question is, where do you play? And so that's where the universal. Would I start with age? Probably not. Probably not. but I'd be more agnostic about what I would start with, depending on what the issue is. Yes?
When you talk about Likert there, I was really surprised, especially with the way you ended the talk about the importance of fighting ageism, about how you think, or what Butler was saying, that the narrative that it was reverting to childhood and childhood memories and being rebellious and being anger as a narrative that might be a way of fighting ageism, whereas this is usually the discourse that falls in the hands of anti-aging argument, that the old person is very much like a child, only without the potential, only without the future. For example,
That's a damn good comment. That's very well put. And you're going to have to give me a minute to start thinking about how this going. I think that when I use the word childlike, I came closest to where Butler would be. Not necessarily where I would be, but where I think he would be. And I really... You know, if I had to use a word to describe him, it would be puckish, impish. He had this incredible smile, and he took incredible delight in some of the most inane things. And that's what I think he meant. I think not immature, and I think his definition of childlike, more than mine, would be this, he called it presentist. It wasn't present-minded, he used the word presentist. And he used the word essentialist, and he sometimes used them interchangeably. And I had trouble, frankly, which is probably why I'm bluffing you, I had trouble understanding where he was going. But you are right. It is sort of funny. But I don't know if, I just have not thought enough to know whether or not he would have been clever enough to do what you just did. You want to say something? No, behind you. Yeah. No? Going once. Yes, please.
Did he deal with any spirituality of any kind?
See, you tell a historian any kind, and you leave the possibility open for a bogus answer. He was agnostic. His children are agnostics. Myrna came from a fundamentalist background in Minnesota. And she developed a brain tumor. But they had a while before she decided that she wanted to be buried. And so she went to a Unitarian church, which in the United States is about as close as we can get to agnosticism and still call it a... And so she went to this church, All Souls Church at 80th and Lexington, and talked to the minister. And they had her memorial service there. And at the memorial service for Butler, that same minister said that he had come by 3 years before and said, I'm not dying, but I bet I do sometime. And so what I want to do is have Myrna's service. And so the children were told that. And so what they did is they invited 12 of us. We were given either 4 minutes or 2 minutes to speak. And we had this sign. I could not believe it. I've done eulogies before. Short, not like this. And But I had to sign an oath that I wouldn't speak for more than 4 minutes. And in fact, I had to show my text that it was 400 words. And plus I was worried about leaving Canada. You know, they're very sticky about customs. And I had this work permit that says I can't re-enter the country. And I'm going, oh my God, I'm going to end up down in New York and I'm never going to go back to Fredericton. How are you going to pay my salary? Anyway, it was very anxiety-filling. Then the damn minister spoke for 25 minutes. Well, good talk. I was telling Stephen earlier, a little callous. He said, well, we're here to bury the dead, then we're going to get on with living. And I thought that was a little harsh for a grieving family from July, but no. Unless, and I never asked him, so I'm speculating, he loved classical music. Loved classical music. And one of his favorite pieces was one of my favorite pieces, and that's the fourth movement of Mahler's Second. And I'm not sure that you can listen to Mahler's Second without thinking some intimation of transcendence. But I don't know that that's the case for him.
Actually, I have one other quick short.
Yeah, your last quick short question.
This is short, I promise.
They like you here, so you can probably get away with it.
I don't know. I didn't know, and I'm really fascinated about Robert Butler's kind of media career that you mentioned, and appearing on talk shows, and that really is kind of interesting because a lot of gerontologists say that's not actually part of their.
Exactly, and that's. Thank you for underscoring it.
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how much of that media attention had to do possibly with identifying or misidentifying Butler with a kind of rising anti-aging sort of culture, anti-aging medicine, and I'm sure he had his criticisms of that as well, but is there some way he could have been also misrecognized as a kind of affiliated somehow? Would anti-ageism and anti-aging have a kind of curious intersection sometimes? Do you think he was...
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about anti-ageism because I'm still pondering your comment, but let's go to anti-aging because the last 2 years of his life, he and I were put on a committee for the World Economic Forum that meets in Davos. And one of the people who was on the original committee, and I can't remember his name, is the guy who started the anti-aging movement. And it caused profound difficulty for the committee because this guy, he was, it's sort of like talking to somebody from the Tea Party. It's gibberish, but by God, they really capture the media attention. And he was very, very upset about that. He also helped start AFAR, which was the American Federation for Aging Research with Dan Curry. And so I would find it hard to believe, not dubious, but hard to believe that was the issue. I will make one apostrophe. The obituaries for this guy were fascinating. Really fascinating. He was really pretty well known for a gerontologist. And virtually any jerkwater paper in the United States, Times, London did a big review. A woman who didn't know him at all interviewed him for Time magazine. And I think that was the most affecting obituary I saw. And what was so incredible to me was that she never met the guy, but they talked on the phone. And he was prepared to talk. And she was obviously one bright person because she put together an obituary that would be the sort of obituary that one of his daughters might have done. I mean, she knew him. And for a guy who was usually fairly cautious about what he said, to have opened himself up like that struck me as really very nice.
Last chance. No, it's not your last chance. We're bringing you back.
Good.
Absolutely. I want to thank you with our very, very humble little present for coming here.
Well, thank
It was a wonderful talk. Robert Butler is so lucky to have you as his biographer.
Let's
You
hope his
are-
daughters agree.
Yeah, no, you're a magnificent raconteur. I can't ask a question, I'm just spellbound. It was wonderful.
You are Irish. Thank you for being so patient. And I'll stick around for a while, right?
Yeah.
Sure.